Good morning. Thank you, Peter. As he said, I'm Mike Hostetler, founder and CEO of Append2. We're a modern web technology company based in the Chicago area. We have an office there, but nobody actually works there because we're 100% distributed. Remote working is a skill that can be learned. However, working remotely isn't enough for your average job. You typically need to have a manager who understands how you can manage remote work. Even if you're the best remote worker in the world and your manager isn't comfortable with having employees out of the office, then there's little chance you'll be allowed to work from home or your favorite coffee shop. There are some amazing benefits to working remotely. Many remote workers feel more productive working at home. They have more time for family, hobbies, work-life balance, and generally just have a better experience and are more productive. A couple years ago, Sun Microsystems, before they were acquired by Oracle, actually did a study on remote working and found that remote workers who work at home full-time actually experience a 98% reduction in their carbon footprint and the emissions that they produce just from their commute to and from work. But if the work you do can't be managed and integrated into the organization that you're working for, none of these benefits really matter. So I began realizing this at my first job right out of college. I was hired at the Bureau of Land Management, a federal government agency, to convert classic ASP sites, this was a while ago, to PHP. A couple months after I started there, we were on the receiving end of a security audit and failed really miserably. The powers that be came in and actually pulled the plug on our data center. We were dead in the water. BLM.gov went down, and I sat twiddling my thumbs. Thankfully, a contract had been signed for the position that I was hired for, so I didn't lose my job, but I didn't have anything to do. Unfortunately, the lack of meaningful work didn't matter as long as I showed up to work and kept my chair warm. What didn't really make sense to me was that I could keep a chair warm anywhere. Because we didn't have that meaningful work and really couldn't even surf the internet because that had been turned off, I brought books to work to just read and fill the time. It was easier for my managers to manage me where they could see me in my cubicle, even though I wasn't doing anything that contributed to my job, because they could walk up and down the hall and actually understand what I was doing. It didn't last long in that position, and I was spending my free time getting involved in the open source community. First Drupal and then jQuery. The way work was done in each of these communities was incredibly refreshing. In each of these communities, a passionate group of people from all over the world worked hard doing various tasks that benefited their respective community. Location didn't matter because there were no managers. Everyone was volunteering their time, and the community ended up managing itself. The other part of open source was that nobody was getting paid, but the system was built so that the freedom to work anywhere was inherent in working with open source, and people could come and go as they pleased. It was about this time that we started planning to start Append2. Reflecting on each of these work experiences, we decided that we wanted to build the company to look more like an open source community than a big government agency. We wanted to build a company where the effort we put into mastering our craft would be appreciated, where we were free to choose between the best way to accomplish the task and how we got the job done, and where everyone would have the freedom to work in a remote environment. We dreamt big and took pride in the thought that we were breaking all the rules. 3 years later, we're now up to about 30 employees spread across 15 states. We keep this map as a reference to just keep track of where everybody's at. We do have managers, and we've learned a lot about building, managing, and operating a company built around these freedoms and the ideals that we're continuing to learn and these ideals. We're continuing to learn something new every day about this subject. Now that I'm a manager myself, I've struggled to manage people in our remote environment and would like to share with you one of the most important lessons we've learned about remote working and why the conversation around this subject has been really muddied. Along the way, we realized that the definition of the word work was really overloaded. It becomes very difficult to communicate and reach a common understanding of what work is in a virtual environment when you don't see each other every day. This leads to a communication gap between the person doing the work and the person managing the work, which ends up causing a lot of dysfunction that only gets worse in a remote environment. Without a common definition of what work really was, and understanding that common definition, it was very difficult to measure effectiveness remotely or otherwise. So I did some research and found that in a typical job setting, when we communicate using the word work, we really are referring to 3 different things. This list really isn't exhaustive, and there's a lot of research going on in this area right now, but the 3 things that I found were kind of a common basis that formed a really nice foundation that we now use in our company. The first is, when we talk about work, we often are referring to the level of effort that we put into a job. When we say that was backbreaking work, it refers to that level of effort. Second, it can refer to the actual task that we're performing. So if you go and debug some code, or I'm referring to it as I'm debugging code today, that's talking about the actual task that you're working on or the outcome you're trying to achieve. The third is we use work to refer to the physical location that we go to perform the task. So I'm going to work today talks about the geographic change as you're going from your house to that work location, where you then put in that effort to complete the task. What's even more interesting about these definitions is that in a typical work environment, they're prioritized, right? So a job role first starts by defining the location where you perform that job. Then they talk about the task that you're working on. And third is your level of effort. The interesting thing about the level of effort is that people always expect 110%, so they kind of leave that at the bottom, even though, level of effort, as we know, working in these environments changes day to day. This was really fascinating to me as I broke it down. If we could teach managers to focus on a task first, rather than the physical location of the job, the idea of remote working would become much easier. If the task in the job was designed in such a way as to eliminate or reduce the requirement to be physically located somewhere, lost my place. Eliminated to be physically located somewhere, it really opens up a range of a lot of awesome possibilities. I mean, I really hope that this seems like an obvious conclusion, because it really should be, but many managers and even many workers that I've met, teaching them this basic breakdown of what work is and how you can break this apart and how a job can be detached from a physical location by focusing on the task first is new material for them. The missing piece here is because we've viewed work through this lens of physical location and have been taught how to manage people, how to set up structures of organization with a physical location in mind. In the end, if we can remove that requirement and start thinking differently, the amount of energy that we expend in our jobs can be redirected into accomplishing the task and the level of effort that we're putting into it, because you're not required to show up somewhere, and that takes a lot of energy, whatever your commute is every day. And in my experience, sitting down and breaking apart this definition of work to people with managerial experience and equipping them with this new perspective actually does work and changes their thinking. It gives them new tools with which to solve their existing problems. Best of all, in my experience, this can be taught, right? We're not up against an impossible task of teaching people something that they should know already or is generational. It empowers them to think about the problem differently and replaces this location-based mindset with a task-based mindset. And when that happens, everybody wins. The remote worker wins because they can now be on the receiving end of working remotely, productivity, location, less of a commute. The manager wins because when their employees do work remotely, studies have shown they're more productive and happier and tend to stay at a job longer. The organization wins because they don't have to be limited to find employees in a physical location. They can look a lot wider, so if you're facing staff shortages, you can go out and find those in a different place. And then the world wins because there really is a pretty significant impact on carbon emissions and impact to infrastructure when people commute every day. Now, this isn't always really a silver bullet, but every situation is different, and finding common ground around this definition of work, it paves the way to have that conversation. It paves the way to reach a solution where you can sit down with your manager and actually get on the same page and talk about moving into a remote working situation that you can receive all these benefits from. So I want to leave you today with remote working is a skill that can be learned by breaking this apart and reaching a common ground on the definition of work. I hope that by hearing and learning this new definition of work today, it will empower you to have that conversation with your manager or boss if you aren't working remotely, or your employees if you're a manager. Thank you very much.